"You're a disgrace." Those were the last words hurled at me before the door slammed and the life I thought I knew disappeared behind it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for understanding. I simply turned away, carrying nothing with me except the sharp sting of a judgment I had never earned. My name is Naomi Jensen, and this is the moment that split my life clean in two. I remember the pressure in my chest as if something had collapsed inward, the sudden and terrifying clarity that everything around me had shifted without warning. One moment I was still expected to comply, to bend myself neatly into a future already chosen on my behalf. The next, I was standing outside with no plan, no protection, and no one rushing after me to reconsider. The silence that followed was colder than any winter I had ever endured, and it spoke more clearly than explanations ever could. In that quiet, I understood this wasn't anger born of confusion or a heated mistake. It was intentional, calculated, a decision made long before I ever stepped into that room. I had been assigned a role, a purpose, a direction, and the instant I refused to perform it, everything was stripped away. The realization didn't strike all at once. It came in uneven waves, each one landing harder than the last, each one carrying the same brutal truth. I had been cut out of my own family for choosing my own life. Even then, as I stood alone, I sensed something darker beneath the surface, a truth that had never been spoken aloud, a consequence that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. I walked into the night unaware that this was only the beginning, unaware that what followed would unravel everything they believed they controlled. The evening itself had begun with an unnatural stillness, the kind that settles when every movement has already been decided in advance. When I entered the dining room, I knew immediately that nothing about this gathering was spontaneous. My father, Richard Jensen, sat at the head of the table with the rigid posture of a man prepared to oversee a transaction rather than share a meal. His confidence filled the space, heavy and unquestioned. My mother, Diane Jensen, moved quietly, deliberate in every step, as though even the smallest miscalculation might disrupt whatever balance my father believed he maintained. My brother, Tyler Jensen, took his place with ease, the ease of someone who understood the arrangement and fully expected me to fall in line beside him. Across the table sat the guests my father had referenced for months without explanation. Their presence clarified everything instantly. The Cole family carried themselves with the assurance of people accustomed to being welcomed into opportunity rather than asking for it. When Nathan Cole looked at me for the first time, his gaze didn't seek connection, it evaluated. He watched me the way one examines a factor in an equation, calm and certain, and something in that attention unsettled me before I could articulate why. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere tightened into something unmistakably orchestrated. Every comment from my father gently steered the conversation toward stability, legacy, and strategic alignment. Tyler echoed him seamlessly, reinforcing each point with the confidence of someone already invested in the outcome. My mother nodded at precise moments, never offering her own thoughts, never disrupting the flow. Her silence spoke volumes. Nathan's attention kept returning to me, not with curiosity, but with possession. His interest lacked warmth, it measured suitability. With every glance, an instinct inside me drew tighter, warning me that something essential was being decided without my consent. Before I fully grasped the intent of the evening, the truth settled into place. Whatever was unfolding had been agreed upon long before I was ever made aware of it. The dinner continued with a steady, unsettling rhythm. Compliments were offered carefully, always circling themes of compatibility and shared values. Nothing felt personal. Nothing felt organic. Instead, it resembled a presentation, and I was one of the terms being negotiated. As the plates were cleared and the room subtly shifted, a tension formed in my chest. I noticed the small adjustments around me, the exchanged looks, the quiet signals between people who already knew what came next. My father straightened with visible satisfaction. Tyler leaned back, waiting for a conclusion he assumed I would accept. My mother folded her hands, avoiding my eyes. And then Nathan stood. He rose with the confidence of someone stepping into a role promised to him in advance. There was no hesitation in his movement, no doubt in his expression. When he reached into his jacket, I understood the purpose of the entire evening. I wasn't being invited to choose, I was being presented. The weight of that realization pressed through me, leaving no space for denial. My future, my autonomy, my life had been placed neatly on display, arranged within expectations I had never agreed to fulfill. As the room waited for my reaction, a calm clarity replaced the confusion. I wasn't shocked anymore. I wasn't lost. I was awake. Awake to a truth that had been forming for years, one no one expected me to acknowledge. I had been positioned inside a plan that never accounted for my voice, and I finally understood how far they were willing to go to keep me inside it. A brief stillness settled before anything happened, the kind that signals an unspoken shift. Nathan stood holding the velvet box with quiet certainty, convinced refusal wasn't possible. My father leaned back, satisfied. My mother lowered her gaze. Tyler waited, confident. The decision had been made elsewhere, in conversations I had never been allowed to join. My presence was not participation, it was display. Before Nathan could move towards me, I stepped away from the table. The motion wasn't dramatic, it wasn't frantic, it was deliberate. They mistook it for nerves, for hesitation before acceptance, but I needed distance. I needed breath. I needed to claim a fragment of myself in a room designed to erase me. The doorway framed an exit that suddenly felt inevitable. When I stepped into the open air, the cool night steadied me. The silence outside held no judgment, only the sound of my own pulse. The certainty arrived fully then. Compliance would cost me more than defiance ever could.
When I returned, the shift in my expression told them everything. My father's confidence cracked. Nathan's anticipation sharpened into irritation. Tyler's patience collapsed into disbelief. My mother finally looked at me, and in her eyes I saw fear, not of scandal but of disruption. The room fractured without a sound. I stood alone in a decision none of them had imagined possible. What followed wasn't born of doubt. It came from conviction hardened over years. My father rose, absolute and unyielding. Tyler aligned with him without hesitation. My mother remained still. The verdict was swift. I was no longer welcome within the life they had constructed. There was no ceremony in the separation, only the finality of being forced across a line I had not drawn. When the door closed behind me, the night accepted me without question, and the truth settled deeper. I had stepped outside of more than a home. I had stepped outside of the version of myself they had always expected me to remain. The hours that followed moved without direction, as if each step was chosen by instinct rather than intention. I walked until the lights from my house disappeared behind me, replaced by the faint glow of distant traffic along the highway. The cold air pressed against my skin, but my mind stayed sharp, refusing to collapse under the weight of what had unfolded. When exhaustion finally forced me to stop, I found myself standing at the edge of a convenience store parking lot, unsure of where to go next. My life had narrowed into a single reality. I had been removed from the place that once defined me, and nothing familiar remained to hold on to. My hands trembled as I searched for something that resembled a path forward. That search led me to one name, the only person whose presence had ever offered steadiness when everything else felt uncertain. Reaching out to her wasn't a plan, it was survival. Hannah Cho arrived faster than I expected, pulling into the lot with a worried expression that broke through the numbness settling over me. She didn't demand explanations or insist on details. She simply guided me toward her car, creating a soft boundary between me and the shock that threatened to consume me. Her apartment was small and cluttered from long work shifts and late-night study sessions, but it felt safer than any space I had occupied that evening. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling in my chest. Hannah's mother, Mrs. Cho, welcomed me with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen hardship before and recognized the early signs of collapse. She offered what comfort she could: meals cooked without questioning, blankets folded with intention, silence that allowed me to breathe. Their support didn't erase what had happened, but it gave me a place to exist without fear of being dismissed. Each day settled into a pattern defined by necessity. I took morning shifts at a nearby convenience store, where routine tasks helped anchor my thoughts. In the afternoons, I worked at a warehouse on the edge of town. The setting was harsh, metal shelving stacked high, pallets heavier than anything I had lifted before, long hours that tested my endurance. But the work steadied me. Physical exhaustion became a shield, muting the emotions I wasn't ready to face. At night, I enrolled in community college classes, determined to create a future not built on someone else's expectations. The warehouse became the place where my resolve quietly strengthened. I developed a rhythm, organizing shipments, tracking inventory, learning how to solve problems before they reached management. Patterns emerged in the chaos, and I followed them with increasing confidence. During one particularly overwhelming shift, a logistical issue stalled every line of movement inside the building. Workers panicked, supervisors barked instructions, and the tension climbed. Without thinking, I stepped forward and reorganized the workflow, shifting teams and redirecting pallets in a sequence that restored order within minutes. That moment drew the attention of Monique Harris, who oversaw operational efficiency for a small logistics startup looking to expand. She watched as the system realigned under the adjustments I had made, then approached with a measured curiosity that set her apart from everyone else in the warehouse. There was no judgment in her expression, only assessment, the kind that recognized potential rather than obedience. Monique offered me a chance to join her team in a junior role, one that required long hours, adaptability, and a willingness to learn quickly. I accepted without hesitation. Whatever waited ahead, it was a beginning shaped by choice rather than obligation. As I cleared out my locker at the warehouse, I sensed a subtle shift within myself, a quiet transformation that had taken root in the nights spent rebuilding my life. I didn't know what the future would demand, but I knew this much. I was moving towards something I had never been allowed to claim before, a life shaped by my own decisions. The transition into Monique's startup began with a pace I had never experienced before. The company operated out of a modest workspace near an industrial strip, where every desk was occupied by someone trying to build something larger than the room could contain. I was given a corner with a borrowed laptop and a stack of tasks that shifted faster than I could complete them. Yet the environment suited me. Chaos no longer felt threatening, it felt familiar, something I had already learned to navigate. Under Monique Harris, structure formed where others saw uncertainty. She assessed my work with a level of scrutiny that sharpened my instincts rather than diminishing them. Her expectations were demanding, but they carried no malice. They required growth, not obedience. I absorbed everything I could: data patterns, operational models, shipment forecasting, and the subtle dynamics of problem-solving under pressure. Each week revealed parts of myself I hadn't known I possessed, skills buried under years of being expected to follow instead of lead. The long hours became less of a burden and more of a framework that allowed me to rebuild the pieces of my identity. I took on responsibilities that stretched far beyond my job title, sometimes stepping into roles simply because no one else was available. The company grew at a speed none of us anticipated. New warehouses came under our supervision. New clients sought systems that could reduce inefficiencies, and Monique relied on me more with each milestone. Her trust wasn't spoken, it showed in the projects she handed me without hesitation. During this time, I met Daniel Ross, a systems engineer who joined the team to develop internal software tools. His presence was quiet and deliberate, marked by a focus that matched the intensity of the work around him. Our paths crossed often, first through shared deadlines, then through collaborative problem-solving, and eventually through conversations that slipped into moments neither of us intended to prolong. He approached challenges with a steadiness that grounded the frantic pace of the startup, and that steadiness extended into the moments we spent together outside the workflow. The bond formed gradually, shaped by mutual respect rather than urgency. Being with him carried no expectation that I reshape myself to fit a vision I didn't choose. For the first time, partnership did not feel like a negotiation. It felt like an expansion, a widening of the life I had rebuilt from nothing. When our relationship grew into something deeper, it did so without interruption or fear. The path that led to our marriage was simple, built on practicality and sincerity rather than spectacle. Life settled into a rhythm that reflected the results of every decision I had made since leaving home. Daniel and I moved into an apartment close to the company headquarters as the startup expanded across the Midwest. Promotions shifted me into strategy work, where I managed teams and implemented operational models for new regions. The achievements accumulated quietly, unaccompanied by applause, but I recognized each one as another step away from the expectations I had left behind. When our daughter, Lily, was born, the world changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Her arrival reshaped my priorities without diminishing my ambition. Balancing motherhood with a rapidly growing career forced me to redefine what strength looked like, not as endurance alone, but as the capacity to build a life that allowed space for more than survival. Daniel supported the shifting demands without question, and our home became a place where effort and care existed side by side. As years passed, the company's expansion created new opportunities, and I stepped into leadership roles that required travel, negotiation, and long-term planning. The stability I once feared I would never find emerged through work I had chosen, relationships I had built, and a future I defined for myself. There were moments of exhaustion, challenges that threatened to fracture the balance I fought to maintain, but none of them carried the darkness of the night I left home. Every obstacle after that point felt manageable in comparison. Looking back, I could trace the line between who I had been and who I was becoming. The distance was vast, shaped not by chance, but by the refusal to return to a life dictated by someone else's expectations. Each step forward held the imprint of that decision, grounding me in a future that belonged entirely to me. The turning point arrived on an afternoon that began no differently from any other. I was reviewing a series of expansion projections when an email notification appeared with the subject line that carried no hint of urgency. I nearly ignored it, assuming it was a routine update or a message routed to me by mistake. But the sender's name, Jenna Jensen, forced my attention into stillness. The distance I had built over years had not erased the instinctive tension that surfaced whenever anything tied to my family crossed my path. Opening the message felt like stepping into a sealed room. The words were concise, stripped of emotion, yet each one landed with weight. My father, Richard Jensen, had suffered a cardiac episode serious enough to jeopardize both his health and the business he guarded with uncompromising intensity. The information was presented without appeal, without expectation, and without assumptions about my response. It simply existed, demanding recognition whether or not I wished to offer it. For a moment, the world around me faded into muted shapes. Spreadsheets, documents, planning boards, all secondary to the shift taking place inside my chest. The past I had distanced myself from resurfaced with unwelcome clarity. The decisive nature of the split, the years defined by silence, the determination that carried me forward, all of it clashed against the reality that part of my history was unraveling without my presence. I set the device aside and inhaled slowly, attempting to steady the reaction rising beneath the surface. When I returned home later that day, the unease had not dissipated. It followed me through the motions of daily life, settling into the quiet moments like a persistent echo. The weight of the email lingered in each thought, reshaping the stability I had spent years constructing. My daughter, Lily, moved around the house with the lightness only children possess, unaware of the shift taking place in her mother's mind. Her presence grounded me, reminding me of the distance between the world I had built and the one I had left behind. That evening, the house held an unfamiliar tension. I moved through the routine of preparing for the next day, but my sense of direction wavered under the quiet pressure of decisions forming just beyond clear understanding. My husband, Daniel, observed the shift with the perceptiveness that had always defined him, though he did not intrude upon the space I needed to think. His patience offered room to confront the complexity of the moment without the force of expectation. I spent the following days in a state of deliberate reflection. Bitterness no longer controlled my response, but clarity did. I examined what returning might mean, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as an acknowledgement of a past that still existed, whether or not I wished to engage with it. The life I had forged was rooted in autonomy, yet part of me recognized the impact that unfinished chapters could have on the future of the family I now led. At work, the expansion initiative in the Midwest resurfaced as a viable opportunity. Our company had been considering a satellite office to support regional operations, and the location aligned with areas near my hometown. The practical benefits were undeniable: proximity to supply routes, access to agricultural clients, and strategic placement for future growth. The idea formed almost naturally, shaped by equal parts logic and necessity. I approached the proposal with precision, outlining the advantages and logistical requirements without revealing the personal weight behind the location. The board responded with enthusiasm, approving the initial steps toward establishing a presence in the region. The decision unfolded with a sense of inevitability, not because I was compelled to return, but because circumstances had aligned in a way that allowed me to confront the past on terms I defined. When arrangements began to take shape, travel schedules, site assessments, operational planning, I felt the shift in my own resolve. I wasn't returning to rebuild bonds or mend divides. I wasn't going to reopen wounds or seek explanations. I was going to face the remnants of a history I had outgrown, carrying with me the life I had built from nothing. The choice held no sentimentality. It was a recognition that closure did not require forgiveness, only the willingness to stand where everything had once fractured. As preparations continued, the inevitability of the journey settled into my thoughts with a quiet certainty. I moved forward not as a daughter returning home, but as a woman stepping into a past that no longer had the power to define her. The day of the trip arrived quietly, without the urgency that usually accompanies travel. The private jet waited on the tarmac, its polished surface reflecting the pale morning light. Lily rested against my shoulder as we boarded, unaware of the magnitude of the journey ahead. The engine's steady vibration settled into the cabin as we ascended, creating a space where thoughts could move without interruption. I had prepared for logistics, for schedules, for work, but no amount of planning could soften the awareness of where we were headed. The flight unfolded with a calm that contrasted sharply with the weight forming in my chest. I reviewed the expansion documents again, relying on structure to counterbalance the uncertainty of the hours ahead. Yet each turn of the page reminded me of the reason this choice existed at all. The past had never required permission to resurface. It simply did. Lily eventually shifted to the seat beside me, tracing the window with relaxed curiosity. Her presence steadied me in an unspoken way, reminding me of the life I had created without anyone's approval but my own. When the jet descended over Wisconsin, the landscape came into view with a familiarity I had long tried to ignore. The airport was small, efficient, unadorned, and the air carried a stillness that settled immediately upon stepping outside. Daniel retrieved our bags while I adjusted Lily's coat, grounding myself in the routine motions that had always anchored me. The car waiting for us carried no symbolic meaning, it was simply transportation. Yet each mile brought us closer to a place I once believed I would never see again. Approaching the neighborhood felt like walking into a memory that had refused to fade. The houses stood in quiet arrangements, aged not by neglect but by time. My father's home came into view slowly, emerging from behind a line of dormant trees. The lawn, once meticulously cared for, showed signs of inconsistency. The windows reflected the muted sky, revealing nothing of the life inside. I stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, allowing the distance between who I had been and who I had become to settle clearly. A movement near the front window shifted my attention.
My father, Richard Jensen, appeared, steadier than I expected, but changed in ways that spoke of the weeks he had endured. His posture was thinner, his expression more subdued, shaped by a vulnerability I had never seen in him. He opened the door deliberately, pausing on the threshold as if reconsidering the act. I did not move toward him. The space between us felt marked by years that no single gesture could erase. He stepped down one stair, then another, but stopped midway, holding the rail as though grounding himself. I watched him take in the sight of Lily beside me, her small hand wrapped around mine. His gaze shifted, not in recognition of a role he had forfeited long ago, but in quiet acknowledgement of a life that had continued without him. The silence between us carried more weight than words ever could. Nothing about this moment belonged to reconciliation. It belonged to reality. I adjusted Lily's backpack and took a steady breath before walking forward, not toward him, but along the path that led past the porch. His hand shifted slightly on the railing as I approached, yet he did not move closer. I felt the air change in a way that signaled understanding, not connection. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, Lily glanced up at me with serene certainty, unaware she had just crossed a boundary I no longer wished to mend. As we continued toward the car waiting to take us to the new office site, I sensed my father's presence lingering behind me, not as a figure to return to, but as a chapter firmly closed. There was no anger in the distance that settled between us, only clarity. I had not come seeking closure, forgiveness, or confrontation. I had come to stand on the ground where everything had fractured and realized that nothing there held power over me anymore. The door closed gently behind us as we drove away, and the house receded into the quiet stretch of the neighborhood. No final message followed, no attempt to bridge the divide. What remained was a silence that defined itself with unmistakable certainty. Her story reminds viewers that walking away does not always come from anger. Sometimes it comes from the acceptance that not every bond deserves repair. The distance she chose was not punishment, but protection, shaped by years of learning what it means to build a life without inherited expectations. Richard faced the consequences of a past shaped by control, discovering too late that authority cannot substitute for connection. In the end, her decision to move forward without reclaiming what was lost reflects a truth many encounter. Closure is not something given, it is something created. If this story offered you a moment of reflection, consider staying with the channel for more narratives that challenge how we think about family, choice, and the courage to redefine our lives.